And welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for choosing to be here this evening. So I would like to introduce our speaker tonight, Mitch Mueller. Mitch Mueller, LPC, SAC, is a licensed counselor who treats mental health and addiction problems from a Christian and Catholic perspective. He completed his graduate training in counseling at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities and also holds a graduate degree in theology from the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. He has many years of experience working with both perpetrators and victims survivors of sexual violence. He considers it an honor and a privilege to be involved in people's journeys of healing and growth. Mitch, we're so glad that you could join us this evening, and you can take it away from here with your presentation.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, I just want to echo what a couple of other people have already said. I do consider it an honor and a privilege to be here. And I do want to repeat some of the disclaimers that were already put out there. We're going to be covering some coping skills. The coping skills are designed to be helpful, to help you stay grounded, to help you reconnect with yourself. But not everybody tolerates the skills the same way. And so if at any point you find yourself starting to get ramped up, anxious, or uncomfortable, please just step away if you need to. There's no substitute for working with a good therapist through issues and finding the skills that work for you as an individual. I'm trying to cast a very wide net here and show some of the most basic and fundamental skills that work for a lot of people. But for each person here, there's a lot of people here tonight. They might not be your cup of tea, you as an individual. So if it doesn't seem to be working for you, or if you're feeling disturbed, please feel free to log off, to turn off the volume, to take a step away. This is meant to be helpful, not harmful. I'm going to begin sharing my screen. Okay, here we go. Okay. All right. The talk today is about coping skills and finding care. So we're going to spend the first part of our time really just talking about what some of these basic coping skills are. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how to find follow-up care, because like I said, there's no substitute for having a good therapist that you click with and that helps you discover what works for you. So we're going to start with some very, very basic mindfulness skills. I invite you all to turn your attention to the present moment, wherever you are, wherever you're sitting, whether you're laying down, standing. I want you to look around the space that you're in right now. And I want you to identify something in or about the space that you haven't noticed before, or something that you don't normally pay any attention to. Could be an object, could be a color, could be a shape. I want you to notice something about that you haven't noticed yet. Let your attention really focus in on whatever that thing is. Let yourself become curious. How is it that you've managed to not notice that detail before? As you focus on whatever that thing is, I want you to pay attention to your breathing. Notice how your breathing feels from moment to moment. Begin to get into a state of mind that is present focused and non-judgmental. Try not to think about the past or the future. Just think about where you are right now at this moment in time. Not judging any part of your experience as right or wrong, good or bad, but just letting your experience be whatever it needs to be in this moment. I want you to turn your attention back to that thing that you noticed just a moment ago. Is there anything new that you notice this time that you look at it? A texture, a color, a shape? Let the impression sink in more deeply. Let yourself notice more and more details about whatever that thing is. You don't have anywhere else to be. You don't have anywhere else to go. You can just appreciate this moment here and now. Turn your attention now back to your breathing. Notice how your breathing feels as you inhale and exhale. Feel your body expanding and contracting with each breath. Notice the rhythm of your breathing, the pace of your breathing, the depth of your breathing. Are you breathing deep into your diaphragm, or are you breathing shallow into your chest? As you breathe, see if you can notice your heartbeat. See what parts of your body you can feel your pulse happening. Maybe it's in your neck, maybe it's in your fingertips, maybe it's in your chest. Pay attention to the rhythm of your heartbeat. Now see if you can pay attention to both your heartbeat and your breathing at the same time. See how many pulses of your heart for each inhale and for each exhale. Notice whether you're breathing through your nose or through your mouth. Notice the feeling of the air as it passes into your nose or into your mouth and back out again. Notice how it feels a little different on the way in from how it feels on the way out. Now let your awareness expand to the rest of your body. Let yourself notice details about how your body is feeling in this moment that you don't normally notice, that you may have never paid attention to ever before. Imagine a line passing from the top of your head through your face, your neck, your shoulders, your arms, your chest, your abdomen, your pelvis, your legs, your feet, your hands. Notice feelings happening on the outside surface of your body, on your skin, on your hair, fingernails, toenails, as well as feelings happening on the inside of your body, muscles and bones and organs. Try not to judge any of your sensations as good or bad, as right or wrong. Try not to control them, but just simply notice them. Notice where you feel warmth, where you feel coolness, where you feel tension, where you feel relaxation, where you feel pain, where you feel comfort, where you feel heaviness or where you feel lightness. Notice how different parts of your body can be feeling different things at the same time. You might have part of your body that feels very tense, and other parts of your body that don't feel tense at all. You might have parts of your body that feel warm, and other parts of your body that feel cool. Let yourself notice more sensations in this moment that are happening in your body. Gently return your attention to your breathing. See if you notice anything about your breathing that you didn't notice before the last time you were thinking about your breathing. Notice the pace of your breathing, the depth of your breathing, the force of your breathing. See if you can notice your heartbeat again. Is it sped up? Has it slowed down? Next, I want you to turn your attention inward into the space of your mind. Think of your mind as a large room. It's a large space. It's a space like your physical body, but it's not the same kind of space that your physical body takes up. It's a mental space. Notice the things happening in that mental space right now. Notice all the different thoughts as they move, the images, the words, the ideas. Notice how they ebb and flow from moment to moment. Try not to judge them as good or bad, right or wrong. Just notice what's happening. Try not to control them. Try not to push away a thought or force a thought into being. Notice how your thoughts change from moment to moment on their own without you needing to put any effort into it. Notice how your thoughts have already changed and you're already thinking something a little bit different than what you were thinking just moments ago. There's a thought that's disturbing or distressing to you, allow yourself simply to take note of that. And return to noticing without judgment. Allow yourself to become more accustomed to your thoughts, more familiar with your thoughts, understanding your thoughts more deeply than maybe you ever have before, observing their movement inside of your mind. Try to maintain an attitude of compassion towards yourself, regardless of what thoughts might be coming up in this moment. Gently begin to return to noticing your breathing, noticing your heartbeat, noticing your physical body. Is there anything new that you notice this time that you come back to the parts of your physical body, your breathing and your heartbeat? Let yourself notice anything new that's coming up. With an attitude of openness and curiosity and compassion towards yourself, regardless of what you might be experiencing in this moment. Next, allow your attention to turn towards your emotions. Notice the emotions happening in your heart right now. Our heart and souls are a space just like our minds, just like our physical bodies, but not exactly the same. It's the space where our emotions happen. Notice how your emotions ebb and flow in this moment. Notice how some emotions conflict with other emotions, how some emotions mingle together. You might be feeling calm one moment and then have a moment of anger. You might be feeling happiness in one moment and a minute later feel some anxiety or angst. You might have a flash of anger, or you might have a mix of sadness as well as calm happening at the same time. Let yourself become familiar with your emotions in this moment without trying to judge or control them in any way. Gently begin to bring your attention back to your breathing, back to your heartbeat, back to your physical body. Is there anything new you're noticing now about your physical body, about your breathing, or about your heartbeat? Have they slowed up or sped up? Gently begin to return to normal. Let yourself wiggle your fingers, wiggle your toes, stretch your arms and legs, stretch your neck, stretch your chest, your back, your shoulders. Begin to move different parts of your body as you gently return to awareness and functioning normally. Take a deep breath. When you're ready, return to normal. Okay, so this is a basic mindfulness exercise. I'm going to explain a little bit about how it works. We're trying to get into an attitude of being focused on the present, not thinking about the past or the future. You notice I said that several times. We want to be non-judgmental towards our experience. A lot of survivors of different kinds of trauma are very judgmental towards their experience. They might have a sensation or an emotion or a thought, and then they become very judgmental towards themselves for having that thought, which then cycles back into whatever the distress is. So if I feel very anxious and then I judge myself for having that anxiety, I'm going to tend to get more and more anxious. I'm not going to reconnect with safety. I'm going to feel worse and worse and worse, and it becomes a runaway freight train. So we want to use this mindfulness to try and break that feedback cycle and reground ourselves. That's why it's so important to be present focused, non-judgmental, right? Then we focus really on the senses. We focus on our bodies, things that we can hear, see, smell, taste, and touch. Breathing and heartbeat are also very fundamental. They're very rhythmic, they're very repetitive, right? And there's a million different ways to cue yourself into your body, your senses, and your breathing and your heartbeat. Um, Many people with PTSD and survivors of trauma have a very complicated and problematic relationship with their bodies. They might hate their bodies. They might be very uncomfortable with their physical bodies. They might not like the way they look. They might not like the sound of their voice. They might not like the look of their face. And that can exacerbate a lot of trauma symptoms and make healing very hard. And so this is just one of many strategies to help you reacclimate yourself and learn to love your own body and to be comfortable in your own body. Then we also focus not just on our physical bodies, but on our thoughts and our intentions, the things that are happening in our mind, our, our images, our impressions in our mind, our desires that are happening in our mind. But we do it in a non-judgmental way. So if I'm desiring a glass of water, rather than actually thinking I desire a glass of water, I take a step back and I say, I'm noticing that I'm having a desire for a glass of water right now, right? Non-judgmental. I'm not saying that that desire is right or wrong, good or bad. I'm just noticing it as another part of my experience. We do the same thing with our emotions. I'm noticing that I'm having a lot of anxiety right now. I'm not saying the anxiety is good or bad. I'm experiencing anxiety. That's a part of my experience. It's sort of like I'm taking a step back from it rather than being right up in the anxiety. The anxiety is out here a little bit at arm's length. And then there's various kinds of activities you can do to stimulate certain kinds of emotions, sensations, and feelings to practice getting used to those things. So if you are really uncomfortable with a part of your body, You might like spend some time touching that part of your body or looking at part of your body or doing something else. If you are really uncomfortable with a certain thought, you might, with the guidance of a good therapist, spend some time gradually approaching thoughts that help you acclimate to that thought that you're afraid of having. Maybe it's a thought of a person or a place or a thing. Um, but these are different activities that you can add. Okay, so that's a brief explanation of what we're trying to do here. And here's why these things are important. For people with trauma and PTSD, there's a lot of problems that arise. People have flashbacks, they dissociate, they lose connection with the here and now, they lose connection with their bodies. They experience a lot of fear, tension, anxiety, and avoidance. They have a negative self-concept. They begin to hate themselves, hate their bodies, hate their lives. Um, and what we want to do is we want to break away from those deep habits. These habits can form very deeply when people have trauma, and they can repeat these cycles over and over again. It becomes a natural way of thinking. Doing basic skills like this helps interrupt that cycle. Other problems that people with PTSD have that create this cyclical pattern are insomnia, nightmares. If you have a hard time sleeping, your body doesn't have and your brain doesn't have the opportunity to process and digest its experiences, which can lead to a lot of anxiety, irritability, depression during the day, which makes you feel more on edge. Other problems that happen are physical problems like physical pain, stomach problems, spine problems, and then, of course, addiction is very, very common for people with trauma and PTSD. So, what you want to do when you're looking for a therapist is you want to find a therapist who can help you go through these three steps. The first thing is to become stable, to break those cycles so that you can ground yourself and start over, right? That's the first thing. That's the most important part of trauma work. If you can't get that stability, you're not ready to go into the next step, which is working through the trauma. And that's where you gently and gradually approach whatever it is, a memory, a thought, an image of something that represents what your experience is, your traumatic experience is. But you do it in a way that is very safe and very stepwise. We don't want to put people back into a flashback. We don't want to put people back and re-traumatize them. We do this in a very gradual way, but that requires a lot of time and delicacy. And then finally, after you do that work, you reintegrate, you find new meanings instead of thinking about this terrible thing that happened to you as your fault or evidence that the world is unsafe or that you cannot live your life like a healthy person. You think about it in a new way, in a brand new way, and you approach life in a brand new way. Various specialties that are really good for this include EMDR or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, prolonged exposure therapy, cognitive processing therapy or CPT, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy or TFCBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, and then a couple other ones that are more famous and a little bit more popular nowadays are this thing called internal family systems or emotion-focused therapy. Other important factors when you're deciding to work through your trauma and find a therapist who can help you work through these issues is number one is your motivation. Do you feel ready to do it? If you don't feel ready to do it, you probably want to find a therapist who can meet you wherever you're at and not jump into it right away. The number two factor is the personality and the relationship that you have with a therapist. So all those different skills that therapists use can be really, really helpful, but it's none of that means anything if you don't have a good, solid working relationship with the therapist and feel very comfortable and secure with that therapist. And so if someone comes to me, and I've had some people come to me and they want to work through their trauma, either with EMDR or some other kind of therapy, and if they don't feel like they have a good connection to me, I'm going to work with them to find a therapist that they do have a good connection to, because not everybody is going to have a good connection, the same connection with every therapist. The third is the complexity of the trauma. the more intense and the more complex the trauma, the more different kinds of trauma, especially early trauma, those adverse childhood experiences, the more delicate and usually the more gradually therapy will need to progress. And also the complexity of mental illness in general. If you have a history of other problems or genetic history of things like bipolar disorder, ADHD, addictions, and other things, that's going to mean that the treatment's going to take more time. It's not doesn't mean that if you don't get feel better really fast that there's something wrong with you. It just means that this takes time to heal from this and to be patient with the process. And then, of course, other medical problems. I have a client I'm working with some pretty intense PTSD right now who has a problem with high blood pressure. And so as we're working through things, we have to be monitoring her blood pressure and her heart rate because we don't want her to have a heart attack as we're working through the trauma, right? Other things are physical pain, physical injuries, or brain diseases like dementia or things like that. Um, so that's just a very, very quick 50,000 foot view of some coping skills and some therapeutic strategies that you might consider as you're looking to take some steps forward in healing from whatever it is that you have suffered from. I hope this was helpful for you. And if you guys have any questions, please feel free to pose those questions. We're going to move on to our next step here, which is this, I guess there's going to be an interview here. And I just want to end this part of my presentation with this message that you're more than your trauma. I want you to see yourself as more than your trauma, not reduce yourself simply to your traumatic experiences and the worst things that have happened to you. I would love for everyone to see themselves, everyone on the earth to see themselves as a beloved child of the creator of the universe. Um, okay, that's all I have here. So I will uh, uh, leave it for Natalie to take it from here.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mitch. You've given us really a lot to think about. And I personally would love it if every meeting I was ever in started with a mindfulness exercise, truly. So like Mitch said, we will be talking through some questions pre-submitted, as well as any questions that you all have to offer for us this evening. Just a reminder, Maggie Flanagan, who, if you go into the chat and click on her name, she's got the word questions next to her name. You can send her a message with those questions, and we would love to hear from you. So just to get us started off, Mitch, so we know that every survivor approaches their healing journeys differently, but some do really desire to integrate faith and prayer into their lives. When grooming happens within the religious context, this presents particular challenges, right? Especially when prayer can be a triggering practice, either through certain expressions of prayer or simply the idea of talking to God altogether. Given the skills that we have discussed tonight, that we've walked through, I'm wondering how we might practice caring for ourselves as we navigate that specific complexity.
That's a really good question. And I could easily spend a full hour, if not longer, probably multiple sessions talking about this. So each one of us has a very complicated relationship with God. We're all very unique individuals. Some of us are believers, some of us are not believers. I happen to be a believer. I happen to have clients who are believers and are not believers in God. Um, and so even take away the trauma, your spirituality is so unique to you and your personality and your needs that what works for one person is not going to work for another person. That said, I do see a number of clients who have been traumatized within religious contexts, or maybe not within the religious context, but their trauma has affected their relationship with their spirituality, and they feel fragmented, which is a very common experience for people who have experienced trauma. They feel disconnected from themselves. Um, and I I encourage people who want that faith to be part of their life not to give that up, so to speak. not to surrender that to their trauma, not to say, well, I can't have spirituality because I was abused. I was abused by a priest, and so spirituality is off limits for me. I think that a lot of this stuff is really evil, and I think to give that up lets the evil win. If you want to have a relationship with God, if you want to have a relationship with Christ, if you want to have a relationship with your Creator, we can work on that. If there's a trauma that is getting in the way, let's see that as the problem rather than seeing yourself as the problem or seeing God as the problem or seeing yourself as too broken to be able to have a relationship with God anymore. You can. It requires a delicate process. I'm working with a woman for the past, since COVID, really. So since about 2021, so 5, 6 years now. And it's taken her about 3, 4 years to get comfortable praying again. And but now she does it, and she feels like she can do it confidently. There were many, many months where she felt like it was fake, like she couldn't be genuine with it. And we worked through that. We talked about it. She had a whole bunch of other things going on with addiction and hopelessness and depression. But it's a slow process. You can reclaim your faith even after trauma. It doesn't have to be something that you lose permanently just because of some terrible thing some bad person chose to do to you. I could say a lot more, but I know that there's other questions that we want to get to.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, especially the reminder that this is, an ongoing process. We talk about a journey of healing, and that's because it truly is something that we are, it's not healed in an instant.
Mhm.
Even when we do the work, as you alluded to earlier, the work takes time.
That's right. That's right.
I want to jump now into a question about a couple of the specific modalities and types of therapies that you mentioned, but then one specifically that you haven't. We had an audience question asking about the movie theater technique, which is sometimes referred to as the screen technique, as a way of processing those traumatic memories. We're wondering if that's something that you've used, if that's something that you see good results with, or any thoughts that you have about that specific modality.
Yeah. Well, anytime we're talking about modalities, we need to keep in mind that there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of modalities. There's so many modalities. There's almost too many modalities because any therapist can sort of take elements of different therapies, pre-existing therapies, and sort of put them together and come up with something new, which is a very dynamic process. That's how therapy, the profession grows. Um, but anytime we're talking about modalities, much more important than what the modality is your relationship with the therapist by far and away. This has been researched again and again and again. If you feel like you have a comfortable, trusting relationship with your therapist, like you can go into dark places with your therapist and that they've got your back, that's way more important than what modality they use. So, with that said, the other thing to know about these modalities is we don't all use the same nomenclature. We don't all call them the same things. And so, one person was referring to an intervention, they might call it, LMNOP intervention, and someone else might refer to the same intervention, same exact technique as ABC intervention. I have not heard of the specific term movie theater or screen technique before, but I'm pretty sure I know what this person is getting at with the question. And it's similar to what a lot of other therapies use, where you try to change the way that you view it. Sometimes in EMDR, we will, instead of seeing things like here, like in a first person perspective, we might imagine it's like out there, like on a screen. Or you might imagine that the screen is getting smaller and smaller and it's fading off into the background and the trauma is playing, but it's not right up here in your face, it's off in the distance. And that does a similar thing to what I was talking about earlier, where it becomes a part of your experience rather than the everything of your experience, right? And that gives people a little bit of distance to be able to reprocess things with a little bit more confidence. without getting overwhelmed and completely taken over by it. And so I think that's what this question is getting at. And yes, it can be helpful for many people. But a lot of people don't really even need to think of it that way. They might think of something different. They might think of their trauma not as a movie, but they might think of it as abstract symbols. Like maybe it's a garage door or a car or a face, or maybe it's a religious symbol or something like that. And they need to think of those items differently. And we might think of them as bigger or smaller, changing colors, whatever, giving them a sense of power and control over their experience.
Thank you. Speaking of various modalities, you mentioned internal family systems earlier.
Mhm.
Someone asked if you could just briefly explain what that is for those who aren't familiar with it.
Yeah, so internal family systems is fairly new in terms of the language that they use. A lot of the concepts and ideas of internal family systems are not particularly new. The idea is that each one of us has within ourselves almost like a family, an internal family inside of ourselves. So we have different parts of us. We might have a part of ourselves that is very angry, and another part of ourselves that is very vulnerable. And we might have another part of ourselves that is very balanced. And so internal family systems tries to come up with names for these different parts of ourselves, and it tries to direct a person to enter into a conversation with their own internal parts. So you might have in a therapy session, you might have a conversation with your inner child, or you might have a conversation with your a part of yourself that is preventing you from accessing a memory because it's playing a protective role. So sometimes people who have trauma, they have repressed memories, and there's a part of themselves that does that repression, says, I don't want you to access this memory because it's not safe for you to access that memory, right? That's too much. You can't handle it. And so you might, in a therapy session, actually enter into a simulated conversation with that part of yourself. It's not particularly new. I mean, Sigmund Freud believed that there were parts of the self, the id, the ego, and the superego. Thomas Aquinas believed that there were parts to the self. There's another therapy called schema therapy, which revolves around pretty much the same idea. But internal family systems is successful because it I think is good at fostering a very direct and meaningful conversation between these different parts and between yourself and these different parts that sometimes can feel very fragmented or can feel very distant, like you might have a hard time accessing your ability to feel happiness or joy because you may have shut down parts of yourself as a protective measure. So I know therapists who do internal family systems or IFS, and yeah, it can be very, very healing for people. But just like anything, it depends on the relationship you have with the therapist, the skill level that that therapist has with that modality, and a host of other factors. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
It does. I think that we could probably offer a whole separate event just focused on learning about all of these different types of trauma treatments.
That's right.
But I'm wondering if you could also briefly explain EMDR and why so many trauma survivors talk about it as being a helpful part of their healing process.
Yeah, so EMDR it does bring something fairly new. It is similar in many ways to hypnosis, but it's not quite the same as hypnosis. EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and it has to do with your movements, bilateral sideways movements of the eyes, similar to what you would think of in classic hypnosis. But what it does is it helps people, similar to that screen technique you talked about before, it helps people get through the experience of reprocessing their trauma. Something about moving your eyes from side to side, or sometimes you do tapping. Something about that is very grounding for people. It helps them stay focused on the here and now and not enter into a complete flashback where the trauma is completely taking over 100% of their mind and their experience. Doing this with your eyes or this with your hands or having tones in your ears helps people stay grounded. And some people say that there's something about these bilateral movements that improves the communication between the hemispheres of the brain, helps people digest their trauma better. Um, it's very helpful. It's very good training. I've completed the training in this as a therapist, and it really helps people learn how to get back in touch with their bodies. It's but that said, it's not the only treatment. EMDR is very well marketed, and a lot of people come to me asking for EMDR, and they have this idea that it's going to cure everything, and it's going to be very easy, and it does help a lot, but I end up still having to do a lot of prep work with everybody for EMDR, because it still can be very unpleasant, and if you're not ready for it, if you're not ready to go into those traumas, regardless of how much bilateral stimulation or eye movements you're doing, you're not going to get better. In fact, it can be re-traumatizing. I just want people to know EMDR is helpful, like these other modalities. It's not a silver bullet. It's not a panacea. And it's still, even if you do EMDR, it's very intense and requires quite a bit of work, emotional work on the part of the client as well as the therapist.
And I'm hearing in your description here, going back to what you were saying about needing to have a trusted relationship with the therapist, that that feels particularly important for a modality like this.
Yes. Yeah. If you're not, I have a client, as a matter of fact, right now that I've been doing prep work for EMDR, and this person is not particularly comfortable with me. It could be my face, it could be my tone of voice, it could be someone that I remind her of, and we've had very explicit discussions about this. Um, and I'm working with this person to get through the prep work. But if this person doesn't feel particularly comfortable around me, it's not going to be a good idea to go into the worst experience of this person's life. And if they don't feel safe with me, right? This need for safety is very, very important. If you don't feel safe here now with whoever you're talking to, it's going to only be that much worse when you unpack some of the worst things that you've ever experienced in your life.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Um, I want to take us in a slightly different direction for this next question. Many of the people who are attending today are leaders in some capacity in their lives. We have church leaders like parish employees with us, but also people who are leaders in survivor care and advocacy, in their employment, in their families, in a variety of different spaces. And I'm wondering if you could talk about ways that people in leadership roles can keep space for these coping skills to be allowed, to be encouraged, to be accepted in the spaces where they lead.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I could talk about this for a very long time. I got to think about what are probably the one or two points that I really want to focus on. The first thing that comes to my mind is leaders need to work through their own issues, right? And leaders are human beings, but if you are a leader and you haven't worked through your own baggage, um, you might not realize it, but you could be putting people on edge around you. And this happens a lot. I mean, think of organizations that you've been a part of, and think of the different leaders you've worked under and worked for, and think of how they made you feel, right? Um, the number one reason why people leave jobs is because they don't like their boss, for instance, right? And leaders, since they're human like all of us, many of them carry their own, in fact, all of them carry their own levels of trauma. They carry their own levels of comfort with different parts of themselves, different parts of their own emotions. And if there's something that someone needs, like an emotional need that someone has, and the leader's like not willing to go there, not willing to allow for that, this person over here has that need is going to feel shut out and shut down. And that's going to be really bad, not just for that person, and it's going to be bad for the whole organization. So that's the first thing is leaders need to work through their own issues. They need to work through their own baggage, whatever that is. That starts with admitting that they're human, right? Admitting that they have these vulnerabilities just like anybody else, identifying what those vulnerabilities are. That may mean going into therapy for some leaders. If not, it should mean going to there are lots of places where you can go to trainings and events and stuff like that over the course of a weekend or two to at least get a basic idea of what your baggage may or may not be. Um, the other thing is the other thing that comes to my mind is when we're talking about leaders typically of adults, right? And so a leader might look at the coworkers who are adults and might think like, well, you're an adult, you should be able to handle this, right? But all of us carry all of these memories and all of these experiences from our entire lives, going all the way back to the beginning. And in many ways, we are adults in some parts of ourselves, but other parts of ourselves can be stuck at earlier stages. If something really terrible happened to you as a child, um, you might not be in that part of yourself at the adult developmental level. There might be part of you that still is kind of in that hurt child, lost child place. And all of us have those things. That's not something that just people with PTSD or abuse survivors have. We all have those things. And so a leader needs to, without having to be like a therapist or anything, but needs to be aware that because some of us have baggage, there's going to be little things that spring up here and there where we don't act like adults. Our vulnerabilities get hooked, our vulnerabilities get triggered, and you have to understand that the person you're talking to is not in an adult mind right now. The person you're talking to is in the mind of the person who experienced this terrible thing when they were 6 years old. The person whose parents got divorced when they were 6 years old and had to say goodbye to mommy or goodbye to daddy or had to go back and forth between homes, right? And they might look and function on the outside like a perfectly okay human being, but deep inside, every single day, there's parts of themselves that are getting triggered or getting beat down and battered. Um, and so there needs to be an acknowledgement that there are parts of us that are quite vulnerable at times. And creating a space for that takes some time, some education, but is worthwhile. I think a lot of leaders probably say, well, let's just cut to the chase and blow past this and get to the work and whatever we're doing. And sometimes that might be necessary, but if you do that too much, you're gonna one miss a lot of opportunities for healing, and two, it's going to be damaging for your whole organization.
Yeah, there is collective work that can be done, but there's also individual work that has to be done, right? And one, you know, you have to have both in some respects when you're looking at trauma. Um, I want to just remind our audience today that if you have any questions, if you could send them to Maggie Flanagan via the chat, we would love to bring your questions and voice into the conversation as well. Thinking about that individual work that needs to be done, one audience member mentions that therapy for CPTSD is often expensive and can be too expensive to sustain long term. Even with insurance, copays can be high, or trauma-informed therapists might not be covered. Do you have any suggestions for people who are having a hard time affording long-term therapy?
Yes, this is one of my soapboxes, as a matter of fact. I'm a member of this thing called, don't mean to make a shameless plug here, but I'm a member of a thing called the Wisconsin Consortium of Catholic Therapists. And one of my things that I'm really trying to do more of is create groups at the parish level, groups that are supportive, that are healing, and there's many, many of these groups that already exist um, that are free to go to. And I think I can tell you when I was working during COVID, I would go to Mass on Sundays. I was fortunate enough to be able to be living in an area where I could still go to Mass on Sundays. And I would see the people in the congregation, some of whom were my clients, some of whom were just people that I knew. And I know this person is struggling with this, that person's struggling with this, and I know that they don't talk to each other. And I know that it would probably be really, really healing and great if they did, but I know I can't facilitate that because I'm bound by confidentiality and they probably wouldn't want me to, right? But I tried to create some support groups, and when I did, a lot of people had a lot of the same issues, whether it's retirement, addiction, issues with their children, issues with their marriage, issues with trauma. And we live in a very fragmented time. We're not just fragmented within ourselves, but we're fragmented as a society, and we're often cut off from the connection with other people that we need to heal and make sense of our experiences. And so I think that one of the best ways that we can do that, and also most cost effective, is by starting support groups like you guys are doing with Awake. And this means, speaking of leadership, this means some people stepping up who have that skill set to do that. And for the church or organizations like yourself to support them and to create those initiatives. But I can tell you, I have more clients than I can see, more people reaching out for therapy. I have a very long wait list, and it's never going to work if all we do is individual therapy. It's going to be too expensive. It's going to be too time consuming, too resource intensive. I'm a very big proponent of fostering support groups, and there are many different programs that are already pre-existing. Speaking of EMDR, there are ways of doing EMDR in a group format. There is a program called Seeking Safety to help people in deal with trauma in groups. There's many forms of DBT or dialectical behavioral therapy groups, prayer groups, 12-step groups. There's many things there. You could just buy a book and start a book club and read a book together and work through a workbook together. That can be tremendously healing, many times more healing than a therapist. You don't necessarily get just because someone has a license doesn't mean that they're going to be the best person to help you. What's more important than anything is do you have a safe, supportive, caring connection with that person? And that person might not end up being a therapist.
Sure, thank you. We have a question from a male survivor who wants to know how important you think it is to have a clinician that has experience working with male survivors specifically rather than mostly women, or vice versa for a female survivor. In addition, is this important for other subgroups like people of color or other marginalized groups?
Yeah, I mean, this is an even bigger question outside of the trauma discussion. If we go back to that principle of safety, comfort, that's going to answer a lot of it there. And so most people in general probably tend to be more comfortable with people who are like them, right? But not necessarily, right? For instance, I've had black clients. I'm obviously white. I've had some black clients who said that they preferred talking to a white dude because they knew if they, in their own community, right, in the city, I won't say where, but in their city, if they tried talking to their own community, people are loud, people are nosy, right? And he's like, I can't talk about any of this stuff with my family. I can't. And they're like, I need to talk to a white dude. All right. So here I am. But the opposite might also be true, right? There's a long history of racism in the United States, and a lot of white people might not feel safe to a black client. Um, that said, getting specifically to the question about male survivors, there's a couple of things that are unique to male survivors that a lot of therapists might not understand. One of them is shame, right? Most survivors of sexual abuse experience shame, but the kind of shame that a male survivor is a little bit different than the kind of shame that a female survivor has. Um, I'm a man. If the fact that this happened to me says I wasn't able to protect myself, right? And women, of course, have that too, but it's just a slightly different flavor for a male survivor. Um, also, coming forward, reporting it, it can be tremendously shaming. There's a huge sense of isolation, and there's a belief that males can't be abused, that especially by women. Males can't be abused by women. A lot of people just think that that's not possible. It's not physically possible for a woman to sexually assault a man. And if that does happen, then that survivor who goes to a therapist might be dismissed, and that often does happen. and male survivors often feel like there is nowhere to go. So unfortunately, we live in an unfair world, but a lot of times the people who have the worst trauma might have to have the most courage in finding the people that actually can help them, and they might have to deal with the most setbacks. It's not fair. I'm not saying, not ever going to say that that's fair, but I am going to say that it is still possible, even given all of that, all of those handicaps, it is still possible to work through it. It just takes that much more motivation to keep trying.
Thank you for that. Um, thinking about triggers, we're wondering if you could offer some suggestions for ways that a person can manage triggers in a discreet way if you're in a situation where you don't want to draw attention to yourself, like someplace like work or church.
Yeah. Well, this goes back to the very beginning. There are many, 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 many coping skills, and finding ones that are effective for you can be a long process, and it can be very tricky. A very good place to start is with breathing. Um, so just a quick neurology lesson. We have our central nervous system. It connects our brain and spinal cord to all the parts of our body. And that nervous system has two modes. There's a sympathetic mode and there's a parasympathetic mode. The sympathetic is like stepping on the gas. That's where your fight, flight, and freeze live. And then there's the parasympathetic, which is kind of like stepping on the brakes. That's where calm, relaxation live. Um, a lot of anxiety, a lot of what happens when people are triggered is very physiological, right? It's not just mental, but that requires connecting to your body, connecting to the physiology, and your breathing is one of the most direct and powerful ways you have of doing that. Every time you inhale, you're activating that sympathetic nervous response a little bit. Your heart rate speeds up a little bit. You get a little bit more tense. If you ever watch athletics, you see people taking really like intense inhales, and that's activating that sympathetic. If you do long exhales, that's going to activate the parasympathetic, which is going to give you an opposite. So you could just sit here for a minute and just keep repeating that for a minute. Your heart rate is going to tend to go down. Your muscles are going to tend to relax. And if you need to do that discreetly, you might just do that through your teeth. Right, very quietly, right? There's a bunch of other things that you can do to try and ground yourself. There's, of course, like an EMDR, there's tapping, there's tensation and relaxation, like we get from progressive muscle relaxation. But whenever I'm working with someone, I always start with breathing.
That feels, breathing through your teeth is not something that I necessarily would have thought about, but it's simple and helpful. And so I really appreciate that suggestion. Um, I just want to remind the audience that if you have any more questions, we'd love to hear them. You can send them to Maggie Flanagan in the chat. She's got questions by her name. Um, we have another question from an audience member about addressing vicarious trauma or secondary trauma, which is something that we have been thinking about a lot in the Awake community. Is treating this kind of trauma similar to how you treat firsthand trauma, or do you approach it differently?
It's there are more similarities than differences. There definitely are differences. But vicarious trauma is real. I can tell you I've experienced it. Uh, you know, people who work on police dispatch, people who work in EMT dispatch, people who work in nursing and all kinds of other caring and helping professions. Clergy get this. Anytime you're working with people in a context where their issues can come up and it comes up over and over and over again, you are going to experience vicarious trauma. And one of the things that we have learned is a lot of little traumas can add up to a big trauma. And so if you're a therapist and you're working with people in a daily grind, you might not even be working with PTSD, but you're working with people who are depressed, people who want to hurt themselves, maybe are hurting themselves. It's not happening to you, but you're seeing it over and over and over again. requires a lot of self-care for me as a therapist to get through these things and admit when I'm feeling traumatized by something. And there are times where I have to spend hours at a time doing my own self-guided EMDR or doing my own walk in the park, my own breathing exercises. I do this on almost once or twice a week. I have to do that, or I do muscle relaxation, stretching. I go to the gym, I run, I do things that really connect me to my body and make it so that whatever that trauma is isn't here, it's out there. It's still there. It still exists, but it's not my whole world. Um, but yeah, vicarious trauma, you're going to experience a lot of the same kinds of need for healing that you would. I think what's different is people, a little bit different is people with vicarious trauma are probably a little bit more prone to deny their need for help or to realize their need for help because, well, it didn't happen to me. I just heard the story. Like, yeah, dude, your heart rate is like 160 right now, right? Like, you're pretty traumatized. You're in fight or flight. Like, but I shouldn't need to help because it didn't happen to me. I don't care what you think you need or don't need. Like, this is this is happening, right? You're all tensed up, right? You can barely move. You can't even like tie your shoelaces because you have so much knots in your back and your muscles, right? Um, the stuff is real, and a lot of people might not acknowledge it as such.
As you're speaking, I'm thinking about the way that we use the word trauma, right? Where sometimes we use it to talk about the experience, the thing that happened to you. And sometimes we also use the same word to talk about the feeling inside. Do you
Mhm.
think that that's where the language is where some of those deeper feelings of secondary trauma, of denial come into play? Or do you think that's more due to, the human instinct?
Yeah, well, the word trauma, if you look in a medical context, if you go to a hospital with head trauma, it means you had a head injury. If you had trauma to your right arm, that means you had an injury to your right arm. If you had trauma to your liver, that means you have an injury to your liver. So the in the big picture, the word trauma just simply means injury, right? When we're talking from a psychological standpoint, we're talking about a psychological injury. Um, and that if we think of it that way, then it might be a little bit easier for someone with vicarious trauma to see that, oh yeah, this it doesn't matter whether this event happened to me or not. I am experiencing a psychological injury, right? And that might changing the way we conceptualize that, I think, might help us think bigger picture. And psychological trauma is very, very unique to the person. Many medical traumas are unique to the person. You could see NFL football players getting beat up and tossed around every Sunday, and what for someone else would be debilitating injury, it would take them out. It might even kill them. For them is just day in, day out. And they might be strong enough that it doesn't really injure them in the same way. Um, in the same way, psychological traumas can be very, very uh, idiosyncratic. They can be very unique to the person. I have worked with survivors of sexual abuse where the part that you would think would be the most traumatic wasn't the most traumatic, right? It was something completely different from what you expect. And that's one of the things that us trauma therapists and those who help those with trauma need to be aware of, that just because we think something would be very traumatic to us doesn't mean that that's what's traumatic to the other person. I see that all of the time. I hear someone tell me a story about what's traumatic. I take note of what I think would be traumatic to me because that's giving me a map into what the person might need to work through. But I'm always knowing that's just a hypothesis. That's just a guess. Because more often than not, as I work through it, the worst parts for someone else are very different from what I think would be the worst parts or most traumatic parts for me.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We have a really honest and vulnerable question from one audience member who says, I am struggling. Do flashbacks and body memories ever go away? What would you say to this person?
Well, I really thank you for the question. My heart goes out to you. My prayers go out to you. I'm sorry that you're experiencing that. Um, I want to say this, that these things can be worked through. There are a lot of people with PTSD, a lot of people with trauma who are experiencing exactly the same thing that you're experiencing. And on a regular basis, people find recovery from these things. It's rarely an overnight recovery. Maybe one case in 100, someone goes to a really great therapy session and it just doesn't happen anymore. They just don't ever think of it again. But when people experience that level of trauma symptom in their body, it usually takes a while to work through. Um, Trauma doesn't um, disappear. Your past is always going to be your past, right? There's that famous book that many of you have heard of, that the book The Body Keeps the Score. I don't recommend most people read it because it can be pretty harrowing at times. But the point of that book is that our traumas don't go away ever, right? You can't change your past, but you can change your future, right? And just because something happened to you in the past doesn't need to dictate what your life is now or what your life is going to continue to be in the future. I have worked with people through trauma and they get better and I never hear from them again. And maybe they've gone through their lives and it's never been an issue. I've also worked through trauma with people who 2 or 3 years down the road, something happens. They've been fine for 2 or 3 years. Something happens, and unexpectedly, stuff gets re-stirred back up, and they start having flashbacks again, and they start having these feelings again. And then we work through it again. And usually we find a new angle, a new thing that we didn't see before that needed to get worked on. And then once we work on that thing, their healing is even stronger. Um, so I think that's probably the best answer I can give. I do think there is hope. Don't despair. Don't give up. I know it's not fair that you have to feel these things. The world isn't fair, life isn't fair. But try to reach deep down inside yourself and find that motivation to push forward and take that next step into healing. I know it takes a lot of vulnerability, and hopefully you find people who are willing to and able to honor that vulnerability and meet you where you're at and help you take whatever the next step is for you.
Thank you for that response and for that encouragement. You spoke about EMDR earlier, and one audience member asked if EMDR messes with the Catholic faith, and if so, how? I think that this is speaking to a concern that some people of faith have about whether trauma therapy or working with a specific therapist might somehow conflict with their religious convictions. Um, what would you say to somebody who has that kind of concern?
That's a really important question. I did address that in part in my graduate thesis in theology at the University of St. Thomas. Modern psychotherapy has a very complex relationship with religion, going back to the early days of Sigmund Freud and then B.F. Skinner. Um, the last 150 years of psychotherapy have been predominantly led by people who were a-religious, if not anti-religious. And so a lot of therapies are not designed to honor people's faith in those ways. That said, a lot of people who believe in God have been helped by them. People who believe in God have been helped by behavioral therapy. People who believe in God have been helped by psychoanalysis and psychodynamic psychotherapy. Um, but there is a very clear history of judgmentalism towards religion from the psychotherapy community, from the psychological community, from the psychiatric community. Of all the different professions, some of the most a-religious and anti-religious are among the mental health profession. I happen to be a mental health professional. I also happen to be a practicing Catholic. Um, And finding a therapist who respects your faith, just kind of like we talked about before with the race and with the sex and the gender and stuff, is a really good place to start. Any ethical psychotherapist, if they have negative attitudes towards religion or towards people who practice religion, they should be able to either not take you on as a client because they can't in good conscience, or help you find someone else who is going to be a better fit, or put their own biases to the side and help you work through that. There are very few what we call evidence-based therapies. These are the therapies that have been studied and have published literature about them and show positive effects in highly controlled research settings. There are very few evidence-based studies that I know in a direct and explicit way will contradict any article of faith for a Christian or for a Catholic. Um, the places where you start to get into some gray area is when you work with people who might be practicing things from other religions, such as certain forms of mindfulness, might really draw heavily on Buddhism or on Eastern traditions. Now, I spend a decent amount of time working with my Catholic clients to help them understand that mindfulness is not the invention of Buddhism. There are many early forms of Christian prayer and mindfulness that have grown and flourished within the church and with among believers. And so changing your frame of mind, that you're not connecting with previous incarnations of yourself or of your past. You're not connecting with another god or incarnation of some Buddhist deity or something like that. You can have a fully blooded Catholic way of being a therapy client. EMDR in particular, there's nothing in particular in EMDR that I'm aware of that would be against the faith. I think there are many ways of packaging EMDR that could be. If you are putting it in like a very um, secular metaphysical context, right? If you're not honoring the soul of the person, if you're not honoring the existence of the person's soul, of their conscience, of their connection with Christ, of the importance of their baptism, of the importance of the sacraments, then yeah, that could be very harmful for people. But yeah, I've already talked a lot about this. I hope this answered the question. I obviously could talk about this for much longer.
I think it did. And you have given us so much to think about, so much to consider tonight, Mitch. Thank you so much. Our final question for tonight, of the many skills and resources that you've offered this evening, what are you, if there's would be one thing that you are hoping that those walking on their own healing journeys would take from that, what is it?
I would say learn to get comfortable in your own skin. Learn to be comfortable with your body. Learn to be comfortable with your experience. That's very often foundational for people is they are fragmented in their sense of self, fragmented in their identities. They're disconnected from their physical bodies, disconnected from their emotions, disconnected from their thoughts. And oftentimes they're kind of running around from one thing to another, but they're not ever grounding themselves. And so doing things that really connect you with positivity, with meaning, with purpose, with connection with other people, all of those positive things are going to be foundational. And that's for most people who are traumatized, that is enough to get them through. They don't need therapy. If they can just reconnect with people that love them, people that they love, with good food, good music, a day out at the park with the wind at your back and the sun in the sky and the clouds overhead and the seagulls and whatever, like all those beautiful things that make life bigger and more meaningful than the worst things that have happened to you, do them and make it a practice to do them on a regular basis, the same way you would brush your teeth, the same way you would go to the gym, the same way you would take a shower. And the more intense and the more long lasting your trauma was, the more time you want to set aside and the more regular time you want to be giving yourself to have those positive experiences. And then what happens is the trauma starts to become smaller and smaller. It's not up here, it's out here somewhere. It's still part of your history, still part of your experience, but it's not the end all be all of your identity and of your life.
Thank you so much, Mitch. You have offered us so many great tools this evening. We're really grateful that you could be here with us tonight.